The air in Ouagadougou was thick with anticipation, streets filled with murals, flags, and chants that carried one name across the capital. Thomas Sankara. For many, Sankara was not just a man. He was an idea, a dream, a fire that burned too brightly and was extinguished too soon. Nicknamed Africa's Che Guevara, he was the revolutionary leader who dared to imagine a Burkina Faso that stood tall, free, and unapologetically African. But in 1987, bullets silenced him, or so it seemed. Now, more than 3 decades later, that fire has been reignited, and the man carrying the torch is none other than Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest head of state in the world today, and the figure who has vowed to restore Sankara's unfinished revolution. In an emotional ceremony earlier this year, Traoré unveiled plans for a national mausoleum in honor of Thomas Sankara. For his supporters, it wasn't just about a monument of stone and marble. It was about rewriting history, reclaiming dignity, and reminding the world that Sankara's dream never died. This mausoleum will not just be a resting place, Traoré declared to a cheering crowd. It will be a school of memory, a temple of African pride, and a call to action for future generations. For Burkinabe citizens who grew up hearing whispered stories about Sankara, this moment was more than symbolic. It was personal. Many had lost family members during the turbulent years that followed his assassination. Many felt robbed of a future that could have been. Now, with Traoré's announcement, those wounds were being addressed in the most public way possible. But the mausoleum was only the beginning. Alongside it, Traoré announced a revival of African cinema, inspired by Sankara's original push for cultural sovereignty in the 1980s. The famous FESPACO Film Festival in Ouagadougou, once a thriving hub of African storytelling, had lost its global spotlight. Now Traoré wants to bring it back, stronger than ever. Why cinema? Because Sankara himself believed that cultural liberation was as important as political liberation. He once said, "He who feeds you controls you. He who tells your stories shapes your soul." By reviving African film, Traoré is doing more than celebrating art. He is building a new narrative for Africa, one not told by Western cameras or colonial textbooks, but by Africans themselves. The announcements stunned the world. International analysts had been expecting Traoré to focus solely on security, terrorism, or alliances. But by tying his leadership directly to Sankara's legacy of cultural, political, and economic independence, he shifted the conversation completely. This was no longer just about Burkina Faso's fight against insurgency. It was about Africa's fight for its memory, its culture, and its dignity. The moment struck a chord far beyond Burkina Faso. In Dakar, students held film screenings of old documentaries about Sankara. In Accra, artists painted massive murals of Sankara's silhouette alongside Traoré's profile. In Johannesburg, a youth-led panel asked, if Burkina Faso can revive Sankara's dream, why not us? The symbolism was powerful, but so were the risks. By invoking Sankara, Traoré was challenging not only domestic corruption, but also international forces that had benefited from Africa's silence. And history had shown, time and again, that those who dared to dream too loudly for Africa often became targets. Still, the young captain pressed forward. Burkina Faso was no longer just a small West African country battling insurgency. Under Traoré, it was becoming the beating heart of a continental reawakening. And the story was only beginning. Because behind the mausoleum and the cinema revival lay a much bigger vision, one that could reshape Africa's place in the world. In the next chapter, we'll uncover how Traoré is weaving Sankara's revolutionary ideas into Burkina Faso's governance, his battles with foreign powers, and his mission to rewrite Africa's narrative once and for all. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before the people and promised to honor Thomas Sankara's legacy, it was not just about monuments or film festivals. It was about reviving a philosophy, one that challenged dependency, corruption, and exploitation at every level of African society. Decades, Sankara had warned that Africa's chains were not only military or political, they were economic. He called debt a form of neo-colonial slavery, and he rejected the idea that African nations must live on loans and handouts from the West. He urged Africans to live with dignity, to rely on their own resources, and to take pride in producing what they consumed. Today, Traoré is bringing those words back to life. A return to self-sufficiency. In Ouagadougou's markets, traders talk about something they haven't heard from a leader in decades. Buy Burkinabe. Wear Burkinabe, eat Burkinabe. This was Sankara's slogan in the 1980s, when he encouraged farmers to feed their nation and tailors to replace imported suits with locally woven Faso dan Fani cloth. Now, Traoré is echoing those same calls. His government is pushing campaigns to reduce reliance on imported foods, to revive local textile industries, and to prioritize Burkinabe businesses in state contracts. It may sound small, but in a country long flooded with imported rice, second-hand clothes, and foreign aid packages, it is nothing short of revolutionary. Redefining partnerships. But perhaps the most radical part of Traoré's vision is how he views international partnerships. Western powers, France, the European Union, the United States, have long maintained influence in Burkina Faso, not only through military presence but also through development programs tied with conditions. Sankara once warned that aid with strings attached was not generosity, but control. Traoré is repeating the same line today. When foreign diplomats offer support in exchange for political silence or economic concessions, Traoré has pushed back. He has accused outside powers of treating African nations like children, incapable of solving their own problems. His message is simple. Burkina Faso wants allies, not masters. This rhetoric resonates deeply with African youth, who see their leaders too often bowing to foreign interests. For them, Traoré is not just a president, he is a symbol of resistance. The Western anxiety, but with every speech, every policy, and every defiant move, Traoré is also raising anxiety abroad. In Paris, commentators warn that Burkina Faso is slipping out of the French orbit. In Washington, analysts discuss whether Russian influence is filling the vacuum. In Brussels, there are fears that cutting ties with international financial institutions could lead to chaos. The truth is, Traoré's policies are not about East versus West. They are about restoring agency, the ability for African nations to decide their own path. But because this disrupts decades of carefully built influence, it rattles global powers. "We are not against the world," Traoré said in a fiery speech, "but we will no longer accept to be dictated to. We will choose our own destiny, even if it comes with sacrifice." The shadow of Sankara, every move Traoré makes is compared to Thomas Sankara. When he rejects lavish lifestyles for politicians, people remember how Sankara sold off ministerial Mercedes-Benz cars and replaced them with bicycles and modest Renaults. When Traoré encourages young people to join community defense initiatives, it recalls Sankara's push for civic participation and collective responsibility. Even his fiery speeches, delivered in plain, direct language, remind Burkinabe of Sankara's legendary charisma. But here lies the danger. Sankara was assassinated in 1987 precisely because his ideas threatened too many entrenched interests, both inside and outside Burkina Faso. By walking this same path, Traoré risks facing the same enemies. The youth factor. Still, one thing is different this time. The youth. Burkina Faso is a young nation, with nearly 70% of its population under 30. Many of them never lived through Sankara's time. They only know him through stories, songs, and grainy videos. Yet, they idolize him as if he were alive today. Now, with Traoré reviving Sankara's vision, these young people feel they have a role to play. Student groups are organizing debates about sovereignty. Artists are producing films and rap songs about Sankara's dream. Farmers are experimenting with local crops to prove the regional domino can feed itself. And it's not stopping at Burkina Faso's grassroots movement is something no foreign power can easily control. Guinea, and even Senegal, youth movements are echoing the same slogans. Leaders who once feared challenging international institutions are beginning to watch Traoré closely. If his gamble pays off, others may follow. This is why analysts call Burkina Faso today a laboratory of sovereignty. What happens here could either inspire a continental shift or serve as a warning of the risks of defiance. The cinema connection, and that's why the cinema revival matters too. It's not just entertainment, it's strategy. Films, documentaries, and festivals can spread this new narrative across Africa faster than any speech. Through cinema, Traoré is exporting Sankara's vision to the world, using art as a weapon of liberation. It's no coincidence that FESPACO, once the pride of African cinema, is being revitalized under his leadership. Traoré knows that wars are not only fought with guns, they are fought with stories. By reviving African film, he is making sure that Burkina Faso controls its image. Not foreign news channels, not biased documentaries, but African storytellers, speaking directly to African audiences. The stakes ahead. The stakes are clear. If Traoré succeeds, he will prove that a small, landlocked country, once dismissed as poor and unstable, can spark a continental revolution of dignity. If he fails, critics will say Sankara's dream was never realistic to begin with. But as the sun sets over Ouagadougou, one thing is certain: Burkina Faso is no longer playing by the old rules. The young captain has chosen a path filled with danger, but also with hope. And in doing so, he has forced the world to pay attention to a nation that, for too long, was ignored. The question now is, what comes next? When Traoré declared that Burkina Faso would no longer bow to outside powers, the streets of Ouagadougou erupted with chants of victory. But behind the cheers, a storm was already brewing. Because in the world of politics, every bold move brings consequences, some seen, others hidden in the shadows. The Western response. Within days of his announcements, statements poured in from European capitals and Washington. Spokespersons used words like deep concern and serious risks. They warned of isolation, of economic collapse, and of security vacuums. Behind closed doors, however, the conversations were sharper. Western diplomats saw Traoré as a dangerous figure, too popular at home, too defiant abroad, and too reminiscent of Thomas Sankara. For them, his revival of Sankara's message wasn't harmless nostalgia. It was a direct threat to decades of influence carefully woven into Burkina Faso and the wider Sahel. Some international media outlets began painting Traoré as reckless, even authoritarian. Commentators suggested that without the UN, without Western aid, Burkina Faso would spiral into chaos. But inside Burkina Faso, the mood was very different. The local support in villages and towns, people felt a rare sense of pride. For years, they had seen foreign forces patrol their lands, aid workers come and go, and politicians make promises, with no results. Now, for the first time in decades, they had a leader who said, "We will rely on ourselves." In Ouagadougou, crowds marched with flags, chanting not just for Traoré but for Sankara. They carried portraits of the slain revolutionary alongside pictures of the young captain, It was as if history itself had been reborn. This groundswell of support gave Traoré something few leaders in the region had: legitimacy in the eyes of ordinary people. But popularity alone cannot defend a nation under siege. The security question. The harsh truth remained. Burkina Faso was still under attack. Extremist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS were active across the north and east. Each week, villages reported assaults, ambushes, and kidnappings. The UN might have been criticized for its inaction, but its departure left a hole, a gap Traoré now had to fill with Burkinabe forces, volunteers, and whatever allies he could find. To address this, Traoré doubled down on his Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland (VDP) program. Thousands of young men and women signed up, receiving basic training and weapons. It was a risky gamble. Arming civilians could empower communities, but it could also spark rivalries and abuses. Meanwhile, whispers of new partnerships grew louder. Some said Russian advisors had begun arriving, offering support where the West had withdrawn. Others speculated about growing ties with neighboring Mali and Niger, both of whom had also broken with France. The message was clear. Burkina Faso was no longer standing alone. It was building a new alliance outside the Western sphere. Economic gamble, but sovereignty has a price. Foreign aid made up a large portion of Burkina Faso's budget. Cutting ties meant losing not just military support, but also development funding. Roads, hospitals, and schools once financed by foreign donors suddenly faced uncertainty. To counter this, Traoré invoked Sankara's philosophy once again. Let us produce what we consume. Let us depend on ourselves. His government encouraged local farming, promoted textile production, and called on citizens to embrace sacrifice for the sake of dignity. In the markets, some traders grumbled as prices rose, but others said proudly, "Better hardship with dignity than comfort with chains." This was the emotional power of Traoré's message. It turned suffering into resistance, sacrifice into pride. The hidden enemies, yet beneath the surface, dangers multiplied. Not everyone welcomed Traoré's defiance. Corrupt elites who had long benefited from foreign contracts saw their interests threatened. International companies with stakes in Burkina Faso's gold mines feared tighter regulations and new taxes. Whispers of plots began circulating in Ouagadougou. Analysts warned that the same forces that had assassinated Sankara in 1987 might try again if Traoré went too far. After all, challenging global interests often comes with deadly consequences. Traoré himself seemed aware of this risk. In a recent speech, he declared, "They will try to silence us. They will try to divide us, but we will not bow. If I must fall for this cause, let it be known. I will not betray Sankara's dream." The words electrified the youth, but also deepened fears for his safety. The media war, and then there was the battle of narratives. International TV channels portrayed Burkina Faso as unstable, on the brink of collapse. Local media, however, told a different story, of a nation rediscovering its pride, of young people mobilizing, of communities standing tall. Cinema again became a battlefield. At the revived FESPACO Festival, filmmakers submitted works about African dignity, sovereignty, and resistance. In theaters, crowds cheered as fictional heroes echoed the same slogans Traoré used in his speeches. It became clear that this was not just a political fight. It was cultural, ideological, and symbolic. The regional domino effect, but perhaps the biggest consequence, was regional. In Mali, Niger, Guinea, and even Senegal, youth movements began waving portraits of Sankara and chanting Traoré's name. Leaders in these countries faced a difficult question. Would they join this new wave of sovereignty, or would they cling to old alliances with the West? Analysts began calling it the Sahel Spring, a moment when the spirit of Thomas Sankara, carried by Ibrahim Traoré, spread across borders like wildfire. But revolutions are fragile. What inspired some terrified others. Western governments spoke of instability. Regional blocs like ECOWAS considered sanctions, and extremist groups, sensing the turbulence, looked for opportunities to expand. Walking the tightrope for Traoré, the path forward was like walking on a tightrope. On one side, the dream of sovereignty, dignity, and a new Africa rising. On the other, the risk of economic collapse, security breakdown, and foreign intervention. Every decision he made was scrutinized, every alliance questioned, every speech analyzed for signs of weakness or defiance. And yet, despite the pressure, Traoré continued to frame his struggle not as personal but historical. In his words, it was not just about him. It was about completing Sankara's unfinished journey. The world holds its breath. As weeks turned into months, one thing became undeniable. Burkina Faso was no longer invisible on the world stage. This small, landlocked nation, once dismissed as poor and powerless, had forced global powers to pay attention. Not because of its wealth, not because of its armies, but because of its defiance. The question haunting everyone, from Ouagadougou to Paris to Washington, was the same. Would Traoré succeed in reviving Sankara's dream, or would history repeat itself in tragedy? The story of Burkina Faso today is not just about one leader or even one country. It is about a continent wrestling with its past and its future. When Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people and declared that Burkina Faso would reclaim its sovereignty, he was not merely making a political statement. He was reigniting a revolution. But as history has shown, revolutions are fragile, and legacies can be both inspiring and dangerous. The weight of Sankara's shadow. Thomas Sankara's ghost looms large over every move Traoré makes. For many Burkinabe, Sankara remains the ultimate symbol of integrity, sacrifice, and leadership. He planted trees to fight desertification, banned luxury for government officials, promoted women's rights, and famously declared, "He who feeds you controls you." By reviving Sankara's Mausoleum and celebrating African cinema as a tool of liberation, Traoré has tethered himself to this powerful legacy. But he also inherits its risks. Sankara was overthrown and killed because his defiance rattled, too, many powerful interests both inside and outside Africa. Traoré knows this, and yet he chooses to walk the same path. The question is, can he survive where Sankara fell? A generation watching one of the most remarkable consequences of Traoré's rise is the way young Africans see him. In cities from Bamako to Dakar, from Niamey to Conakry, posters of Traoré appear alongside murals of Sankara. Youth groups chant his speeches, share his videos on social media, and see in him a leader who speaks their frustrations out loud. This matters because Africa is the youngest continent in the world. More than 60% of its population is under the age of 25. If Traoré becomes a symbol for them, the ripple effect could outlast his rule, spreading into future generations. But symbols are fragile. If his government fails to deliver results, if insecurity worsens, if the economy collapses, if corruption returns, that same youth could turn against him, disillusioned once again. The security tightrope Burkina Faso remains in the crosshairs of extremist violence. Every week there are reports of villages attacked, soldiers ambushed, civilians displaced. Traoré's bold moves, expelling France, rejecting the UN, and relying on local militias and regional alliances, are seen by supporters as the path to independence. But they also carry risks. If security improves, he will be hailed as the man who proved Africa could defend itself without Western guardians. If it deteriorates, critics will argue he gambled with lives for ideology. The balance is razor thin. The global chessboard. On the global stage, Traoré's defiance has transformed Burkina Faso into a piece on the geopolitical chessboard. Western powers fear losing influence in the Sahel, a region rich in resources, strategic in geography, and crucial in counter-terrorism efforts. Russia sees an opportunity to expand its presence, offering military partnerships where the West retreats. China, too, watches closely, with its investments and infrastructure projects across Africa. Burkina Faso may be small, but it has become symbolic, a test case of whether Africa can break away from old colonial structures without collapsing into chaos. The West calls Traoré reckless. African youth call him courageous. The truth may be somewhere in between, but one thing is certain: he has forced the world to pay attention. The Cultural Revolution. Beyond politics and war, Traoré has tapped into the power of culture. The revival of FESPACO, the film festival, that once gave voice to African struggles, is more than entertainment. It is propaganda in the noblest sense, a weapon of ideas. Cinema, music, poetry, and storytelling are carrying the message of dignity and sovereignty across Africa. They are tools that Sankara himself once championed, and Traoré has resurrected them for a new era. For ordinary Burkinabe, this matters. It means that sovereignty is not just a military slogan. It is something they can see, hear, and feel in their everyday lives. The risks within. But even as Traoré speaks of sovereignty, dangers lurk within. Burkina Faso's economy is fragile, heavily dependent on gold exports and agriculture. Corruption, if left unchecked, could return like a disease. Regional divisions, ethnic tensions, and the burden of displaced populations threaten national unity. And then there is the ever-present danger of coups. The same military that brought Traoré to power could one day turn against him if factions grow restless. History has shown that in the Sahel, power is never secure for long. A symbol, larger than himself. And yet, despite all these dangers, Traoré's greatest achievement may not be what he builds in Burkina Faso, but what he inspires beyond it. For the first time in decades, young Africans are discussing sovereignty not as a dream, but as a possibility. They are looking at Burkina Faso, small, poor, landlocked, and seeing courage, defiance, and hope. That symbolism cannot be killed easily. Even if Traoré were to fall tomorrow, the spark has already been lit. The spirit of Sankara lives again, not just in statues or mausoleums, but in the hearts of a new generation. Final thoughts. So, what does the road ahead look like? If Traoré succeeds, he could become the modern face of African independence, a leader who dared to say no to the most powerful institutions in the world and survived. His name would stand alongside Sankara's in the pantheon of African heroes. If he fails, he may be remembered as another idealist who tried and fell. But even then, the movement he has unleashed may continue without him, carried forward by those who believe Africa's time has come. In the end, the story of Traoré reviving Sankara's legacy is not just about one leader or one country. It is about a continent refusing to be silent. It is about the power of memory, the strength of youth, and the unshakable dream of freedom. Burkina Faso's future is uncertain. The road is dangerous. The enemies are many. But one truth now rings across Africa, louder than bombs, louder than sanctions, louder than fear. The dream of Sankara lives on.